to maintain a vital circulation. Of course, the greater the sum of artificial falsified indebtedness, the less the rates of interest we can withstand or service. Over the finite lifespan of the system of exploitation, then, interest rates have to be perpetually reduced as a greater sum of artificial indebtedness precipitates immediate failure under rates of interest which, however wholly unjustified, were tolerable to earlier, lesser sums of artificial indebtedness. But this doesn't mean the purported Federal Reserve, which is neither federal nor a reserve of anything, is more beneficent. On the contrary, as we see, should we purportedly begin to grow out of the perpetually escalated recession, they raise interest rates, ostensibly to serve us somehow by preventing our prosperity. And of course, as we see, they do this by imposing yet greater cost upon us in the form of interest. But in this lie that they take from us to prevent some purportedly damaging rate of growth, therefore they inadvertently confess the cause of the failure, for they themselves increase interest to push us back toward recession. And likewise, they relieve interest to no more than permit our most marginal survival. Equally evil, they confess to take from us, ostensibly to our benefit, without providing anything to us at all, but the purported service of unwarranted taking. But hardly can Bernanke be using his purported power in ways the world has never seen. All through this, the declining phase of the second lifespan of the lie we call economy, we have seen interest rates necessarily decreased only because as the sum of falsified artificial indebtedness increases, the rates of interest must decrease, or the subject society fails quickly under a wave of deflation ensuing the artificial destruction of their creditworthiness by interest itself. It is not his power, then, by which he mysteriously reduces interest rates, more so than we have seen in two lifespans of the purported Federal Reserve System. On the contrary, Bernanke suffers a conundrum himself of powerlessness, because so long as interest exists, and so long as we either must borrow interest back into circulation to maintain a vital circulation, or we must pretend to rescue the system by multiplying debt further, all that either he or we can do is to ensure our failure. Bernanke's unwarranted power, then, is a power to take, but as the means of taking is inherently and inevitably terminal, his is not a power to avoid the consequences of a terminal multiplication of taking by perpetual multiplication of artificial, falsified indebtedness. The terminal failure of the system is inevitable because the mere process of maintaining a vital circulation multiplies a sum of falsified debt in proportion to a circulation or remaining capacity to pay. Bernanke's power, then, if it is one, is only to preside over that inevitable failure with the purported but impotent power to no more than regulate the speed of the remaining phases of the inevitable collapse.
During the panic of 2008, he committed trillions of dollars to rescue the financial system, and the Fed dropped interest rates nearly to zero.
Exactly, then. We're only seeing more and more and more of the same because we can only see more of the same until the system collapses. And of course, The collapse persists so long as anyone is paying interest out of circulation, and we must either then borrow that interest back into the circulation to maintain a vital circulation, or pour further debt into circulation in a facade of purported rescue, which in fact only ensures and expedites failure, should we ever pretend austerity is possible.
Now, in a new move that's become controversial, Bernanke intends to commit another $600 billion to hold down interest rates.
Nothing but lies, then. There is nothing new about this at all. It's even part of a long, persistent pattern of pretension, which is already proven not to avert failure. But how? By what principle does pouring money into an inevitably failing lie of economy actually hold down interest rates? After all, it is no more than Bernanke's decision what interest rates can, or even purportedly must, be. He needs to do no such thing, then, to hold down interest rates. For, in fact, his lie would then be to deny it is his finger on the interest button. On the contrary, only the fact of inevitable failure restrains interest rates, because we could not survive higher rates of interest, even as the lesser rates we now suffer multiplied the stupendous, still increasing artificial debt of our time into the present inevitable failure. A failure which is caused by interest, and a failure which no amount of regulation can save from the consequences of interest. What Bernanke is pouring money into, then, is the lie, for the sake of perpetuating the crimes against you, telling you all the while with a quivering lip and a far worse audacity than most of us could ever ourselves imagine, that he is saving the system of stealing from you for your benefit, that saving his fellow perpetrators will restrain interest, while in fact it is the process which interest itself comprises, which only inevitably manifests in such sums of artificial indebtedness that we inevitably fail, even at purportedly restrained interest rates. It is not even his option to raise interest rates without precipitating even nearer term failure. So this is nothing more than a tactic to instill false fear in you, that if you don't tolerate his preposterous attempts to save the purported financial system from a process which makes that system destroy itself, you will suffer the failure which he guarantees you by preserving that crime against you in any way he does.
Chairmen of the Fed rarely do interviews, but this week Bernanke feels he has to speak out because he believes his critics may not understand how much trouble the economy is in.
Well, of course they rarely do interviews, because it is only a cloak of pure mystery which can protect the lie from our scrutiny. But who says Bernanke better understands what trouble the economy is in? Unless it is his purpose to deceive us, he can save us from the cause of the failure by preserving the cause of the failure itself. It is not his purpose to make us understand, for he could never preserve the lie if we did. The purposes of this interview are straightforward and sufficiently transparent, particularly as the interview can only avoid conclusive explanation of cause and effect if it is to succeed in its purpose of stupefaction.
We wanted to know whether we're headed for another recession.
More lies, and how do we know this absolutely? Because interest can only multiply artificial indebtedness in proportion to remaining circulation or capacity to pay. It is a lie, too, then, that we suffer cycles of recession and recovery itself, but relative to an inherently escalating rate of deterioration, which we never overcome, and eventually, inevitably succumb to. in the form of a terminal sum of debt which Bernanke has no way of preventing, but by ending the system of exploitation itself and adopting mathematically perfected economy. After all, here they are telling the lie of repeated cycles of recession and recovery. Since when did we recover from the recession we are in? What do they mean, another recession?
Whether Congress should extend the Bush tax cuts.
Congress has no option but to extend the Bush tax cuts, because multiplication of artificial indebtedness has imposed so much further debt upon us, we can hardly afford to service that debt. It is already beyond terminal proportions. So Congress, too, perpetuates the lie by simply breaking the rules of the system on the behalf of government, that users can only hope we someday recover, that they may reap even greater unearned taking from us. Yet if that multiplication of unearned taking weren't in fact terminal, we wouldn't be confronted with the present conundrum, would we? So the change we can believe in is in fact only more of the same.
But first, we wanted to talk about unemployment, which has been at 9.5% or more for 16 months.
Well, to whom exactly then, and why, does that sound like a recovery?
The unemployment rate is just not going down. Unemployment is just about the same as it was in mid-2009 when the economy started growing.
Did you catch that? An economy which was purportedly growing, while in fact it must have done so without any increase of employment.
So that's a major concern, and it looks that at current rates that it may take some years before the unemployment rate is back down to more normal levels.
Rather than this preposterous idea of suffering yet another recession, then, what's really happening here is one recession is being sustained onto a substantially further period of time.
We lost about 8 million jobs from the peak, and I wonder how many years you think it will be before we get all those jobs back.
Well, you're absolutely right. Between the peak and the end of last year, we lost 8.5 million jobs. We've only gotten about 1 million of them back so far.
What's with all the conflicting information? If unemployment has remained the same and is likely to remain the same long into the future, how do we get 1 million jobs back? Did our population increase that much, our workforce increase that much, that even though we employed 1 million more people, somehow the unemployment roll stayed the same? I really don't think so. In fact, that would have to be impossible.
And that doesn't even account the new people coming into the labor force.
Then the lies are proven taller. But why would you not account for new people coming into the labor force?
At the rate we're going, it could be 4 or 5 years before we are back to a more normal unemployment rate, somewhere in the vicinity of, say, 5 or 6%.
4 or 5 years.
Mind you now, these deceivers are trying to impress upon you a positive outlook. 4 or 5 years. They're talking about, is it possible we would drop into another recession? How can it possibly be that this isn't a continuance of the same recession and a continual, perpetual drop-off, which has occurred for years and years and years and years in relation to an ever-escalating sum of artificial indebtedness, which isn't even two, these mere publishers of evidence of our promissory obligations to each other, who multiply that falsified indebtedness to them into terminal artificial indebtedness and the present failure.
And Bernanke told us something else that makes that even more painful.
The other aspect of the unemployment rate that really concerns me is that more than 40% of the unemployed have been unemployed for 6 months or more, and that's unusually high.
So in 6 months you become concerned with perhaps 5% of this unemployment rate, which is artificially deflated and purposely misrepresented. being unemployed for